Also, thanks to everyone who came here, and also thanks to the organizers. You've been doing a really great job. So let me first, you already heard a little bit about me, but let me give you a bit more of an introduction of myself. So my name is François Martin, as you've heard. François is my first name, and I'm a senior full stack software engineer. And you may be wondering, what is a software engineer doing at the testing conference? So actually, I used to work in test automation before for 2 years before I switched to development. And I also am a member of the Swiss Testing Board. So the ones of you who joined the opening keynote of WIM, you probably have heard a lot about ISTQB and so on. And I'm also quite active in the ISTQB actually. There I'm part of the advanced and expert level working group. And for example, one of the things I'm doing is I'm one of the co-authors of the upcoming security test analyst syllabus. So yeah, and you can find the ways that you can reach me on the left here. And I don't have that many slides. I only have this one more slide. So if you want to get access to the code for all of the demos that I'm about to show, make sure you scan that QR code on the right. And also, by the way, I forgot to mention on the left here, I hope I'm not blocking it, you will be able to scan the QR code for the questions. So you can feel free to enter questions there anytime. I will answer questions at the end of the talk, but you can already submit them now, or you can also ask them later in person if you prefer. I'm fine with any of that. Don't worry, by the way, I will show this QR code again at the end. Just I thought, I will give you some time to scan it if you are interested in it. So let me do maybe some quick polls, and I have to maybe step aside a bit because it's so bright to be able to see you, to see who is raising their hand. So first, I would like to know who of you is a software developer or engineer? Okay, so 1, 2, 3 hands. Okay. And so who of you would say that you write code or you have written code before? Okay, that's a lot more hands. That's great. Nice to see. And so who of you is a tester or in QA? Okay, so that's most of you. Good to know. Okay. And so I would also like to know who of you is a tester and used to be a developer? Okay, so also just 1, 2, 3, maybe. So not that many. Interesting. Okay, that's cool. So maybe the ones of you who said that you are right, that you've written code before, that you write code, is anyone of you familiar with Java? Okay, quite a lot of you. Great. Okay, nice. And JavaScript? Okay, also quite a lot of you. So it seems like you're on the right talk at least. To those of you that didn't raise their hand that you're able to write code, my presentation will be quite code heavy. So if you notice at some point that it's not that useful to you, then feel free to just leave. I don't take it personally. But of course, I feel like it's always useful to know how to how to do those things, or also that you're able to help your colleagues who are working in the software development to, for example, review their code or to bring new ideas to them how they could write their tests. Because if I had learned something, especially when I was a tester, it was that developers usually are bad at writing tests. And kind of my aim was to change this. And I'm doing this, for example, through my talks, or I'm at least aiming to try to do that. So, before we, continue, or at least, before I don't have any more slides, so I will just jump into the different demos here. So if you scan the QR code, you will get a link via email to this repository. So you can look at this all on your own afterwards, and you will be able to reproduce all of these demos that I'm showing you today. So you can see it mentions here also in the README that you can click on the folders of the individual demos to see just some instructions on how you can run them. And we will go through all of them. So first off, a lot of you know Java, so that's quite good because a lot of my demos, they base on Java, but they are not only tools for some of them that you can use only with Java, you can also use them with some others. I will make sure to mention that. But so let me start out with parameterized tests. So that is something that has been a feature of JUnit for quite a while, but a lot of people still don't know it, which is why I like to show it, if I can. Just to get some confirmation in the last row, is it big enough for the font? Oh, interesting. Oh, wait, maybe I need to stop sharing. Good, let me see. Maybe now? Okay. So is it big enough or should I make it a bit bigger? Maybe in the last row, can you give me a hands up? Okay, that's great. Good, thank you. So you can see here we have a very basic calculator application. We just have, here we have a function which is called add, which has two parameters, a and b, and it takes those two and adds them together just for this demo. And then also have a function which is called isOdd, which gets a number and it returns if it's odd or not. And if we go to the tests, you can see that here I'm using parameterized tests, as I mentioned. It's quite easy to do with JUnit. You just specify parameterized test. You can specify value source, and then you can specify values you want to test. Like for example, here I want to test the isOdd method, and I want to pass it different parameters and see if it returns true, so if it's odd or not. And you can see if I run this test, then as soon as it's done running, you will see that it was successful. And so that was great. We can also look at the ones that are successful. And you can see the useful thing is also that it shows to me the different kind of values that it tested. So if one of the tests was failing, I see exactly which test is the one that is failing. And there's also a more, let's say more advanced version of that, which is the CSV source that you can use, where you can provide CSV data. So I feel like that's also something for you to know as someone who is not, writing code as a developer. You could, for example, supply your developers with some CSV files which contain test data, and they can load it in and write a unit test with that. So here you can see I added it inline just to make it a bit easier to see, but it's just as easy to just add a file and link to it. So, just adding a CSV file. And you can see here we have the add function that we are testing. And here we have those three values in each of the rows. And you can see those values correspond to A, B, and the expected value. So for example, 0 plus 0, I expect to be 0, 0 plus 1, I expect to be 1, and so on. And again, I can run this. And you can see the nice thing is here in the name part, I wrote that I want to have it have the name of the index, and then following with the first parameter, then plus the second parameter equals the third, or uh, we count from 0 as developers, so it's 2 from the index. And so you can see here on the left, we have here, for example, index 1, which is 0 plus 0 equals 0, 0 plus 1 equals 1. And you can see, for example, if I were now to add, let's say, a new test case where I would make a mistake, let's say, tests can have mistakes as well, right? If I add one that says 1 plus 1 equals 3, if I run this, you can see exactly here, this case is failing. So this is really useful if you write tests without using a parameterized test. So just by duplicating the logic over and over, which I see quite a lot, you have the disadvantage that, for example, if this test was failing, you don't know if the other cases are failing as well or they are not. And in this case, I can see 1 plus 1 equals 3, and it fails. And it said it expected actually to have 3, but it was 2, which in this case, of course, is correct. But so you see, it makes it also very easy to troubleshoot those issues, which is why I like this feature a lot. And also, one thing I notice is it is much easier to add new test cases. So for example, if I notice, oh, I don't have a test case yet with minus, so I can simply add one here. I can say, I want to have -1, +1 should be 0, for example. And then I could run the tests again, and I see, okay, it passed, so that's great. So I also noticed it tends to be better this way because people are less hesitant in pull request reviews. So when you're reviewing code, to simply suggest like add a new case for this because it's just one line. It's not adding a lot of code for it. And also, of course, less code makes it more maintainable. And then there's a third way I'm going to show you. There are more, but this is just 3 of the common ways I think are really useful. Um, there is one where you can use a so-called method source, where you can provide a method for it. And then you can also here provide the three different values, just like with the values, with the CSV source. The only difference here being that you cannot only add numbers here, you could also add objects, for example, and more complex things. So the CSV source is useful if you have just strings and numbers and so on, or text. But if you have, let's say, an entire object that you want to pass as a parameter, for example, you could do this with a method source. And here you have the same principle. You can also specify a name. And again, if you run this test, it looks very similar to the way that you've seen earlier. So now that we have seen this one, let's continue with mocking, which is one thing I feel like is maybe also not done enough in software development. So I have an easy example here of a simple service which handles the currency conversion between two different currencies. So here you can see we have an external API that we are using. And if you're using an external API, usually it doesn't make sense, especially in a unit test, but also in an integration test, usually it doesn't make sense to use the external API because usually you have limits on how many times you can call them. Sometimes it costs for every request that you're making, and you don't want to, of course, drive up the costs with running the tests, or else you will maybe get asked to run the tests less often, which is bad, as we know all, right? And you can see here we have some logic, but especially we are calling this client, which just simply makes an API request, so it's not really complex in any way. But what you usually want to do is when we are testing the service and we have the client as a dependency, we want to make sure that we are not using this client. This is also a good practice, by the way, every time you have something that you call externally, to have this in a separate class and then use this to make the request to the third-party service so you can mock it as well in a test, like in a unit or integration test. And then here we just call this get conversion rate. We pass the currency we want to convert from and the currency we want to convert to. Then we take that amount, multiply it by whatever we get back from the conversion rate, and we round it to 2 decimal places. And if we look at the test for that, then we can see we have this convert currency test. And this is also something I don't see a lot of people doing. So with Mockito, which is what I'm using here to mock it, you can add annotations like this one. And this makes it very easy because you can then simply define add mock for everything that you want to mock. And the cool thing is you can even define add inject mocks, which even if the case is that you have a constructor here that you don't have the possibility of passing in the parameter, you can still have it injected into this field here. So you don't even need to change the code to be able to do this, which is usually rare. Usually you need to, if you're not using this annotation that I've shown you earlier here, then you need to just pass it when you're creating the object, and it also creates the object for you, which is very useful. So now you can see we can say when we call the get conversion rate method on the client, and we pass USD and euro, then we want to return 0.9119. We define the amount that we want to convert, and then we just call this method on the service, and then we verify at the end if the number that we have here, so 91.90, is the converted amount, and we can simply run this. And we see that it passes. So this is also great. So now let's see another demo. So maybe let's switch to something that's a bit more, let's say, more different, and then we'll get back to the JUnit stuff a bit later. So one part of testing that I've seen being done not as much as it should be is also more like things like load testing or performance testing. Probably, I guess most of you know JMeter. I mean, I'm just curious, how many of you know JMeter? Okay, so that's most of you. That's great. So I intentionally didn't plan on showing JMeter because I was pretty sure every one of you knew it already. But there's one tool, I usually use JMeter when I really have time and I, really get a dedicated task to do a performance test for something. When I can take my time to create really a proper test case, just like you would do it for a proper load test. But sometimes in development, or else I feel like, just when you're maybe testing something and you want to quickly know, can it withstand some load, or, just roughly how well does it perform under load? There's a tool which is called Artillery. Um, it has the advantage, in my opinion, that it's a bit easier to use compared to JMeter. Especially there is less overhead. I feel like with JMeter, you have quite a lot of things you need to configure first and you need to think about. But of course, it has also its advantages. And just to show you, for example, with Artillery, you can have a simple config file that looks something like this. You specify the target you want to test. This could also be, for example, one of your test environments. So, and then you can simply define here, how long do you want the test to take? How many users do you want? By the way, I wouldn't recommend usually testing with 1,000 people. That's maybe a bit overkill. But just I noticed that with 100 people, the API that I'm using here as an example is robust enough that it doesn't produce any errors. So it isn't as interesting for the demo. And so this would be 40 seconds. And here you can define the URL you want to test, or you can even define multiple. This is just a very simple version of it. And here you need to have Node.js installed. So you can see in the READMEs, I always included, what kind of requirements there are, and also how you can run them. And you can see a link to the documentation as well if you want to learn more about this tool. And you can see this is how you install Artillery. And then I have a sample backend I've prepared. And here's like an extra tool tip if you want. If you want just to try out something to have a basic backend, then you can use this tool, which is called JSON server. There you can simply define a file like this. So just a JSON file with different kinds of like things that you want to use, like, for example, posts, comments, and profiles that you want to be able to retrieve from the backend. And then even, for example, if you're writing a test, and even if your development team isn't ready yet to still be able to see if your test works correctly, this is a very easy way with which you can start up a backend quite quickly, and so you can use this to already be early, which is always a good thing. So you can see when I start up this JSON server, then I have here those three things that you've seen in the JSON file. And if we access those, we can see them, just here in the browser, for example, what kind of values we have as we entered them into the JSON file here. So, I'm running now this simple test that I mentioned earlier, this one that just has this arrival rate of 1,000. So, and the duration of 30. So just to prepare you a bit, once this test is done, you will see that, so on the one hand, you can see already some metrics when you're running it. And, just to prepare you a bit, there will be some errors that we will see probably. I mean, unless there's maybe a demo effect or something. And most of them will probably be the connection being reset. I am not sure. It could, of course, also be that this is related to, this could be related on the one hand, of course, to the application itself, this JSON server not being robust enough for 1,000. But it could also, at that point, with so many users, be just a limitation of my network card or, my laptop by itself. So just keep this in mind. So you can see it finished running. And we can look at the results. This is just a very simple one. You can see we have errors. So we have econ reset, so the connection reset in 729 of the cases. And you can see the response times. So the fastest one was 0, so instant. The max was 229 milliseconds, so it's quite fast still, I would say, even with that many users. And you can also see the request rate. So you can see there were quite a lot of requests that went through, actually. And you can see the mean, the median, the P95, P99. Those values are similar to what you get out of JMeter. And you can even configure it to have a bit more of an advanced setup. So, like, for example, here you can see it. I won't run it because it will take a while, but you can also define like as you do in JMeter, like different phases, and you can also define like ramp ups to different numbers of users. And you can even get the APDEX, which is something that I use a lot with JMeter as well, to have a metric to be able to tell how fast or slow the application is. And you can test multiple different things, just for you to look at in case you're interested in writing a more, let's say, complex, load test this way. But I really feel like the big advantage for me is, just being able to have this simple file. If you got the code earlier, you can just simply, take this file, modify it slightly, change 2 lines, and then you can already run a simple load test. It's really easy, which I really love about this. So then let's see, what else do we have? So of course, just to also cover the JavaScript part, what also a lot of people forget sometimes is that the front end needs to be unit tested as well. So, and also in the front end, you can do parameterized testing actually. So here we have kind of the equivalent to the backend function. We have a function which is called sum. We have, again, 2 numbers that we pass in. In JavaScript, it is the case that you have 2 numbers. So this could not only be just whole integers, this could also be floating point values. And then we have a plus b. And then if you look at the tests, this is an example of how you could write the tests. I personally like writing it in this style quite a lot because it seems very readable to me with those columns. So one testing tool I didn't show because it's a bit exotic and the setup is a bit more complex, but it's Spock, if anyone of you have heard of it before. It's a tool which also allows you to write parametric tests with a table-like layout as you have here. And then you can just run them. And again, here, as you have with the previous thing you've seen in JUnit, you also have a nice output. So you can say, for example, should return 2 when 1 is added to 1, and so on. And of course, it's very easy to just add another case, like if I want to add -2 plus 1 should equal -1, for example, and then I have, just like that, another case that I can run this way. Okay, good. So now maybe to get to something that probably in the area more of let's say end-to-end testing. Here there are quite a lot of frameworks that you can use and libraries and tools in general. I have to say the one that I prefer actually the most is called WebDriver.io. I'm curious, does anyone of you know it? WebDriver.io. So here's how you write it. So it's like WebDriver with IO at the end. How many of you know it? Okay, so there are more than I expected, so 5, 6 people. So yeah, so just to quickly show this off a bit, what I really like about WebDriver.io is that it is a tool that by default tests in parallel. I feel like that's something that more tools should do, and it's, I think, the only tool that comes to my mind spontaneously that by default runs the tests in parallel. Usually you need to configure this in some kind of way. Here it's actually the opposite. You need to configure it specifically if you want it to not run in parallel. So this really enforces that you write tests in a way that is, possible to run them very concurrently and very fast. And so here I can show you if I run them, just because they take a while. Oh wait, that's the wrong one. Here I can simply run this script, and you will see it opens a web page up afterwards. I hope the internet is good enough. And you can see it started 3 different Chrome windows here. So because I have 3 different test suites, and it parallelizes per suite by default. See, now here it finished, and you can see some of the tests they failed. And this is actually on purpose. I wrote tests that fail on purpose. And one tool I've seen very few people know, even though I know some people that know WebDriver.io, but this is one tool not that many people know, which is called Allure. So who of you knows Allure reporting? Okay, so also quite a lot of people. That's cool. Nice. So just to those that haven't seen it before, you can create a so-called Allure report. I also added a command for that here, and it opens it up in your browser. And you can see it looks really nice. And also one big advantage of Allure is, I mean, here I only added end-to-end tests, but you can also extend it to have your whole testing included in it. So for example, you could also include your unit tests result, you can include the results of your integration testing, and then you have one nice dashboard overview with all of the different testing that you have. And I used this at a previous project where the business people wanted to have an overview over the tests. And then we included just in the CI a tab where you could see this report. Just it was pointing to the last report that ran on the CI server. And you can see, for example, here I have on the one hand a simulation of a failing test. And you can see here it shows me that the post title, was expected to be existing, but it didn't exist as it was expected. And you can see I added, for example, here the severity. And this is also a feature that you can specify, like in Allure, you can tag specific tests with, for example, the severity of critical. So if you have a look at that, you can see it's very simple. It's just adding add severity critical into the test. And then this way, this points Allure to knowing that this is a severe test. And this helps you because if you look at the graphs, you can see they are grouped by severity. So they are normal by default, but here you can see this is a critical test. So this really makes it easy if a test fails to know how you need to prioritize it, especially if you have big test cases. So here then, you can see I have also a flaky test simulation. So this is just to show, because there is a flaky test detection feature in Allure. So you can see if we go to the history, I didn't run the test that many times in advance. So we don't really have a history, but usually you can see there is a history. I can quickly show you from an example of where I ran the tests a few more times, just so you can see, so we don't need to spend a bit more time. So if I go here to the flaky test simulation, you can see, let me refresh the page. Okay, usually it would be present, but it doesn't seem to be in this case. Okay, so at least we can see the failed tests here. So yesterday it worked, I don't know, it's the demo effect, I guess, but usually you will be able to see this bomb here next to the test if it's a flaky test. And you can see what I really like is in the history, you can see the success rate of the test. So you can see if a test is, for example, successful or if it's failing, how many times it passed in the past. And this also helps you to evaluate if your tests are flaky, of course. Like if you see that the test here has a success rate of 53.33%, you see, okay, this test clearly is flaky, so maybe we should take a look at it and fix it. So this helps you also to get an overview. So this is a really nice tool. I really recommend. There are a lot of different things you can do. This just barely scratches the surface, but this is really something I recommend. Oh, and also something I want to show is you can embed more data. Like for example, what I like to do is, especially in end-to-end tests, is to include the source of the page. Because usually if a test fails and it's flaky, it's a bit difficult sometimes to reproduce what the issue was. And so here, just by having the HTML and being able to see, for example, if your selector wasn't present because maybe you didn't wait long enough or something like that, you can easily find out how the state of your page looked like. And there's also a video you can look at, like here, for example, I can simply run this video. You can integrate this also into WebDriver.io, and you see here it enters student, it enters the password, it continues, and then you can see it says logged in successfully. It's just I added at this point just a fail, so this is why it fails. But in usual cases, this would help you troubleshoot your test quite a lot. And in a different project, we also used a remote cloud with WebDriver.io. And there we even included like a link to the remote cloud page where you could see details to the test execution. And it also allowed you to instantly debug the application and things like this, which is very useful. So you can quite extend this to a big degree, and this saves you a lot of time. What I also usually do, here I left it out because it would have been a bit more complex, but you can, for example, also get the logs from a backend and include them, or logs from your front end from the console. And this is also something I like to include because it makes troubleshooting so much quicker, because you for sure know the feeling of reproducing a test and then it takes so much time, or sometimes it doesn't happen because it's a flaky test and it's very difficult to reproduce. And this way, if you have all of this data, you usually don't even need to reproduce it. It's easy enough to simply follow, use the data you have and fix your test this way. And this saves you a lot of time as well. Then another tool is called Pumba. It has quite a funny name, but just to show you, it's a testing tool for Docker containers. So it allows you to do something which is called chaos testing. So here we can, for example, run this example application, which is very simple. It just does a ping to example.com. And then we can run Pumba with a configuration in this case where we say that for 1 minute, we want to delay each of the requests by 3 seconds on this specific Docker container. So I run it here. And then you can see, if you look at the times now, they jumped instantly from 0 to 3 seconds. And this allows you to really easily test if your application handles the load well, and handles, for example, if there is a bad network connection that you have, is it still working with that or not? So I have a lot more demos, but I don't have that much time. So maybe I'll show you one more that I really feel like is one that not a lot of people use, but should maybe use more. And it's one that is called test containers. Maybe some of you know that. So with test containers, you have the big advantage that you can quickly start a Docker container to, for example, have a database. And this makes test data management quite easy, because you can simply start a Docker container with your database, and then you can try out some things. You can throw the database away and you can have a new one. And there's also another thing which is called ToxiProxy, which is a tool which is built by Shopify. And it allows you to test things like for example, as you can see here, in this case, we have a test, for example, where we add some latency and some jitter into the network connection. And this allows you to also test in a way how your application behaves if the network is not that good. Or you can outright test how the application behaves when you, for example, cut the whole internet connection, as you can see here. Just recently I had an application that failed catastrophically when it just for a moment didn't have an internet connection, and our log was spammed full like crazy. And this was the tool I used to reproduce this. I often hear the phrase that people tell me, it's not possible to test this. Kind of seeing how well things like this works, kind of shows me, how it is possible to test a lot of different things. So if I run the test here, oh, I'm in the wrong folder. Wait, it's the wrong command, I think. But thankfully, yeah, I'm in the Pumba directory, so I have to go into the test containers folder. And I think it should work now. Yeah. So you can see I can run the tests, and it will now test. I have a Redis application here, so it starts a Redis container, which is, you can imagine it's something being like a database, and it tries those two things, and you can see the build is successful. So it was successful in trying to see, does the application behave as we expect it to when we cut the internet connection, for example. So I also want to leave some time for questions. So let me see, are there any questions yet in the Slido? Okay, there are quite a lot of questions. So maybe let's cover the questions. So if you're interested about any of the other demos I had prepared but didn't have time to show, you can also approach me when you find me on the hall, and I can show you some more if you're interested. But let's go through the questions here. So somebody says here, the ISTQB enthusiast. Okay, that's great. CompTIA and CEH certificate have practical and theory parts to pass. CCSSP has 90 out of 125 questions to pass. Will ISTQB Security Advanced Cert be able to compete? So I'm not sure. I mean, so on the one hand, it doesn't have a practical part, which is of course a bit of a bummer, but it is quite difficult to bring in a practical part in an ISTQB exam. It's something we've been trying to do more, of course, but this is maybe an unfortunate thing that we cannot really include. But I think anyways, it would have made more sense for the security test engineer, which is also a syllabus that is coming soon. But there I was involved at a very late stage, and I also proposed this practical part there because it's something that makes more sense, because there, as the engineer, you're really executing the tests themselves. As the analyst, as you're more doing the analysis, as the name says, I don't think it makes that much sense. But it will not have as many questions you need to pass. It will be similar to other syllabi in the same range. So yeah, but thanks for the question. Let's look at the next one. How do you integrate this toolbox into an existing project, using it as a separate repo, injecting it as a whole, or maybe just parts of it to an app repo? That's a really good question. So actually, for most things, I recommend including them into the same repo if you can. Of course, this also depends if you, let's say, for example, have a full stack application where not everything is just in one repository, but spread across multiple. Then the question is like, which repo do you put it in? Usually, I advise to put them into the repos that seem to make the most sense. But I usually like to have them in the same repo, especially because when you're running the build pipeline, when you're submitting a pull request, so you're able to get instant feedback and not delayed feedback. So for example, you only get feedback when you merge the pull request, and then usually I noticed people don't tend to really notice when this happens. So usually really recommend putting in as much as possible. If you have just one repo for your whole project, put it in there for sure. In my examples, I just put everything into separate repos for you to make it easier for you to understand what parts you need to include if you want to include those tools in your application. But yeah, thanks so much for the question. Then the next one, switching from QA to development. How do you manage the mindset when testing versus developing? Actually, I kind of have a panel discussion about this at the Testwares conference in a month or so. But it's probably a bit of a big question to answer in this short time frame. But I would say, in short, if you switch from QA to development, I think it makes sense that you really try to engage this more in a way that you try to collaborate with them, so because I feel like working together works best. Like, for example, try to continuously encourage QA to do pair programming with you, for example, by just, they are trying to, write the test case or come up with them, and the developers implementing them, for example. Something like this works really well. So let's see. Do we have time for one or two more questions? Yes, okay, thank you. So what is focus for you early performance testing? Do you use DB or some other dependencies in your performance testing? Do you run in CI pipeline these tests? So that's also a good question. So I would say in a CI pipeline, it's usually quite difficult because most tools are not really suited to be run in a CI pipeline, and usually it's difficult because the CI pipelines are not really reproducible environments to run them to get, let's say, statistically significant results. So usually, when it comes to early performance testing, I just, especially if you're talking about that early, in the development stages, I just do it on my machine against, for example, my local instance that I'm running of the application. If that's possible, of course, depending on application, but if it's possible, I try to do that. And then usually that shows already a lot of bottlenecks and things you need to, improve. And then as soon as I got it to a point where this test is stable, I then, do it on a test environment, but I always include all of the dependencies, of course, except for external APIs. External APIs, I tend to be a bit careful because, as I mentioned, I try to make sure that when I'm using external APIs, that they are, they don't have a huge, throttling on the rate limiting or something like that, to ensure that we are not running into any issues. But of course, I try to also, in case of external APIs, to run a short burst test if possible, even in a production-like environment if possible. So yeah, it would be nice to be able to run it in CI pipelines, but I found there are not that many tools that can run it well. But this could be, of course, something that's interesting to be able to continuously verify. But I think anyways, usually it's enough if you do it, for example, once before you release. I feel like this is something that is, maybe something that breaks more slowly. It tends to break more slowly, not really, just from one single change. So how does WebDriver compare to Playwright? So I think I like both frameworks quite a lot, actually. But I really like about WebDriver, especially WebDriver IO in this case, you can also use it for mobile testing, for example. I'm not sure if something is planned like that for Playwright, but I had cases before where, for example, an app was first, just a web application, and then suddenly they decided to include a mobile application as well. And then, it was very easy if the application was very similar or built with a hybrid technology where you could easily just add a mobile application for free, essentially. You could reuse even the same stack that you had, the same tests that you have. I also have a talk about this that I did like a lot of years ago, that goes about this subject on how to test mobile on multiple platforms and so on. But that's one thing I really like about WebDriver IO, and Playwright doesn't support so far. I think it's just, you have a bit more flexibility with WebDriver IO since it follows just a regular protocol that also Selenium and other things use with WebDriver. And Playwright is a bit more closed in that sense, but it's also a great tool, I feel like. So it's a bit difficult to decide. I tend to go more with WebDriver IO, as I mentioned, for the reasons, from my experiences, kind of, but both are good. So the last question, how you make sure your CI Java is around when generating our HTML report? So I'm not really sure I understand the question. Is the person in the audience who asked the question? Oh, can you maybe elaborate a bit more? Yeah, I mean, not really, but okay, yeah. So the JRE, you mean, right? Yeah, yeah. Ah, okay. Okay, I see what you mean. So there are two. So the question was, how do you, for example, when you have, so you need the Java JRE to be able to run Allure since it's Java based. But if you are in a node container, for example, where you don't have Java, how do you handle this? So one of the options is to, for example, you can make an intermediary container that has both Node.js and Java, or there are some actually on Docker Hub, for example, as well that you can use for this purpose. Another option is just installing Java, the JRE when as one of the first steps. Of course, this makes your pipeline a bit slower, which is why I usually don't recommend doing this as well. Or of course, what you can also do is you can archive the Allure results in your node pipeline job, and then in your in a following job, following the previous job, you take those artifacts you got from the previous job, and you can simply in a Java Docker container generate a report there as well. This is what I tend to do because it also allows for better parallelization, because then you don't need to handle the Allure report process thing at the same time as running the tests and so on. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you so much. So maybe the last question. After that, I will be available in the Ask Me Anything corner if you have more. Could WebDriver be used in headless mode? Yes, definitely it can. So it's just one config you need to do in the capabilities. You will see this in the documentation of WebDriver IO, or approach me later and I can show you how. Yeah, great. So thanks everyone for joining my talk, and thanks for the great questions. I hope you learned something new today.